The carriage lurched through the iron gates of Wycombe Hall, and Catherine Deverell tightened her grip on the velvet strap. Rain slanted against the windows, blurring the gray facade of the house into something out of a cautionary tale. Inside her glove, the letter from Margaret still crackled, a frantic scrawl begging her to take her place, if only for a day, until their father's debts could be renegotiated. Catherine had not intended to steal her twin's future. She had intended only to be a shield. But as the carriage wheels crunched to a halt and a footman in severe livery opened the door, she knew a day would never be enough. The butler led her through a hall of cold marble and darker portraits. No flowers, no welcome. The air smelled of beeswax and old rain. She was shown into a library where the fire had been lit more for form than warmth. The Duke of Wycombe stood with his back to her, a tall silhouette against a window streaked with storm. He turned, and Catherine understood why the ton whispered. Lord Julian Wycombe was handsome in the way a cliff face was handsome, angular, unyielding, a face cut by grief and time. Gray eyes assessed her without any softening. "Miss Deverell, you are punctual." His voice was low and even, entirely without warmth. "I was taught punctuality is a form of honesty, Your Grace." A flicker at the corner of his mouth, gone before it could be named. He gestured to a chair. "Then let us be honest. You understand the terms of this arrangement. Your father's debts will be cleared upon our union. I require an heir, nothing more." Catherine folded her hands. Margaret would have stammered. Catherine merely inclined her head. "I am aware of the contract, Your Grace." He studied her longer than was polite. "The miniature I received showed a girl with a habit of looking at her slippers. You look at me as if you are cataloging my flaws. Perhaps you prefer women who study their footwear. I can attempt it if it pleases you." The remark hung between them, a blade wrapped in silk. The Duke took a step closer, and the firelight carved his face into hard planes. "What pleases me is authenticity, Miss Deverell. You would do well to remember that." Dinner that evening stretched taut as a violin string. 12 courses served on silver plate that Catherine estimated could settle her family's accounts twice over. The Duke asked clipped questions about her upbringing, her education, her opinion on the estate's tenant farms. She answered with precision, every detail memorized from Margaret's letters, every hesitation suppressed. Only once did she falter, when her gaze drifted to a large portrait above the mantel that had been draped in black velvet, its frame just visible. A servant caught her glance and paled. "You will not speak of her," the Duke said, catching the direction of her eyes. His tone could have frozen the Thames. "I did not intend to," Catherine replied. Later, in a bedchamber hung with moss-green damask, she unpinned her hair with trembling hands. No, with hands that quivered from the day's restraint, a detail she would never admit. A maid had already unpacked her trunk. Tucked inside a folded shawl, Catherine found a second note from Margaret, written in haste and hidden after the first. "Dearest Kit, Father says the contracts are signed. If the Duke learns of the switch, we are all ruined. Stay until the wedding. Be braver than I ever was. Forgive me." Catherine pressed the paper to her lips and closed her eyes. Downstairs, the Duke sat alone in the library, the miniature of Margaret Deverell open on his desk. The painted girl had soft lips and a tentative smile, pretty, pliant, forgettable. The woman who had dined with him tonight possessed the same dark hair and gray eyes, but the light inside them was entirely different. Sharper, sadder, someone who had seen difficulty and not flinched. He traced the edge of the ivory frame. "Who are you, Miss Deverell?" he murmured to the silent room. The fire popped. A log shifted. The storm outside began to build. By her third morning at Wycombe, Catherine had learned the rhythm of the house. The servants moved quietly, as if treading near a sleeping beast. The Duke kept to his study until midday, emerging only to ride the boundaries of his land with a steward who seemed perpetually braced for a reprimand. The draped portrait in the dining hall remained untouched, a silent accusation. She took refuge in the walled garden, where early roses were beginning to bloom. It was there that Lord Benedict Wycombe found her, a sketchbook open in her lap, her charcoal capturing the angle of a stone urn. "You draw," he said, dropping onto the bench beside her with the easy confidence of a younger son. Meg Deverell never drew. At least, that's what the Dowager's letters claimed. Catherine kept her hand steady. "People change, my lord. Letters are often months out of date." Benedict grinned, a flash of charm his brother lacked entirely. "True. I once wrote to a cousin that I despised gooseberry fool, and by the time she replied I had eaten 3 servings. He leaned back, appraising her. "You are not what I expected, Miss Deverell. Neither frightened nor fawning. Julian must be beside himself." She allowed herself a small smile. "Your brother does not strike me as a man easily discomposed." "Julian is easily a great many things. He has merely perfected the art of concealment." Before she could probe further, a shadow fell across the lawn. The Duke stood at the garden gate, riding crop in hand, his face unreadable. "Benedict, the bailiff requires your signature on the mill lease." His gaze shifted to Catherine, lingering on the sketchbook. "And Miss Deverell, I trust you are not tiring yourself. We have the Fawcett dinner this evening. You will need your strength." It was not a question. It was a command dressed in concern, and Catherine recognized it for the test it was. She closed the sketchbook and rose. "I shall be ready, Your Grace." The Fawcett dinner was a modest affair by county standards. Only 20 guests crammed into a drawing room that smelled of hothouse lilies and old port. Lady Fawcett, a woman built like a galleon in mauve silk, embraced Catherine with theatrical warmth. "My dear Miss Deverell, how altered you are! I remember you as such a shy little thing at the Basingstoke Assembly. You barely spoke a word." Catherine returned the embrace. "I have learned that silence is often mistaken for timidity, Lady Fawcett." The older woman blinked, then laughed uncertainly. The Duke, standing 2 paces away, watched the exchange with an intensity that made Catherine's skin prickle. He offered her his arm to lead her into dinner, his gloved fingers cool against her wrist. The soup had barely been served when the interrogation resumed. The squire's wife, a cheerful woman with more curiosity than sense, asked about the Deverell family's dogs. "Your late mother bred those charming little spaniels, did she not? Do you still keep them?" Catherine's spoon paused over the consommé. Margaret's letters had mentioned a spaniel named Pip who had died 3 winters ago, but the squire's wife was asking about breeding, a detail Catherine did not possess. She took a breath. "We had a pair of tricolors. They were my mother's favorites. After her passing, my father could not bear to keep them, so they went to my aunt in Bath." Beside her, the Duke set down his wine glass. "Your aunt in Bath? I was under the impression your aunt resided in Shropshire." The entire table seemed to lean in. Catherine met his eyes. "Both, Your Grace. My mother's sister lives in Bath, my father's sister in Shropshire. I often confuse the two." "You do not seem the sort of woman who confuses anything," he said, so quietly only she could hear. The dinner ended with cards and coffee, but Catherine's pulse did not settle. When she excused herself to the library to retrieve a book she had left earlier, the door closed behind her with a soft click. The Duke stood before the fireplace, the flames outlining his severe silhouette. "You are not Margaret Deverell," he said. His voice was calm, the way the sea is calm before a squall. "I want the truth, now." Catherine lifted her chin. "I am whoever I need to be, Your Grace. That does not make me a liar." "It makes you something far more dangerous," he replied, stepping close enough that she could smell sandalwood and rain on his coat. "It makes you a mystery I am compelled to solve, and I am not a man who tolerates mysteries in his own house." The library stretched silent between them. Catherine held his gaze, every nerve drawn taut, knowing a single misstep would shatter the fragile world she had constructed. "You will give me your real name," the Duke said, "or I will summon your father tonight and demand an explanation that will likely end his parliamentary aspirations." Catherine's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady. "My name is Catherine. I am Margaret's twin, older by 7 minutes. She was terrified of you, your grace. Terrified of the rumors of this house, of a man she believed had buried one wife and would bury another without a second thought. I came in her place to judge the truth for myself." He did not rage. The fury she expected never surfaced. Instead, a queer stillness overtook him, as though some internal mechanism had seized. He turned away, bracing a hand on the mantel. "You believed the gossip," he said flatly, "that I was a monster who had driven my wife to her death. I did not know what to believe. I only knew my sister was trembling so violently she could not hold a teacup. I could not let her face a marriage she feared more than death." A log collapsed in the grate, sending up a shower of sparks. When the Duke spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "My wife, Eleanor, died giving birth to our son. The child was stillborn. I held her hand while the physician bled her, and I watched the light leave her eyes over the course of a night that lasted a year. The world decided I must have been cruel to her, a convenient story. I did nothing to correct it." Catherine took a step forward. "Why would you not defend yourself?" "Because guilt felt appropriate," he said, turning to face her. "I could not save her. I could not save our child. Letting the world think me a villain was a penance I understood." The admission hung between them, raw and unvarnished. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, compassion, dangerous and unbidden. "Julian," she said, testing his name for the first time, "I am sorry." Before he could reply, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the house. Rain slammed against the windows as if the sky had split open. A servant burst in moments later, breathless. "Your Grace, the bridge on the East Road is flooded. The carriage cannot depart tonight." Catherine was trapped. The household retreated to the upper parlor as the storm raged. Candles guttered. The dowager's ancient spaniel whined beneath a table. Benedict produced a chessboard and challenged Catherine to a game she had no hope of winning, her mind elsewhere. The Duke watched from a wingback chair, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, his gray eyes never leaving her face. When Benedict excused himself to check on the horses, the space between Catherine and the Duke contracted. He rose and crossed to the window, watching lightning stitch the horizon. "You were willing to sacrifice your own reputation for your sister's safety," he said, not turning. "That is either remarkable folly or remarkable courage. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps they are the same thing, your Grace." "Julian," he corrected, "if we are to be trapped together, you may as well use it." She joined him at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his coat. "Julian, then, what happens now?" "Now," he said, finally looking at her, "you stop pretending to be a woman you are not, and I stop pretending I am not intrigued by the woman you are." He reached out, and his fingertips brushed her cheek, a touch so feather-light it might have been imagined. Then he withdrew his hand as though her skin had burned him and walked out of the room. Catherine stood frozen, the thunder rolling through her bones, the ghost of his touch lingering like a brand. She realized she was no longer afraid of the Duke. She was afraid of how desperately she wanted him to touch her again. The storm cleared by dawn, leaving the parkland glittering under a pale sun. Catherine had barely slept. She dressed in a simple gray walking gown and descended to find the house in an uproar. An unfamiliar carriage stood in the drive, its horses lathered. Standing in the hall, swathed in traveling velvet and radiating indignation, was the Dowager Duchess of Wycombe, and beside her, pale as milk and visibly trembling, was the real Margaret Deverell. "What is the meaning of this?" the Dowager demanded, her cane striking the marble floor. "I received an anonymous letter claiming my son has been entertaining an impostor, and now I arrive to find my own informant, Miss Deverell, waiting at the posting inn, confessing the entire sordid scheme. Explain yourself." Margaret's eyes, huge and wet, found Catherine. "Kit, I'm so sorry. I couldn't bear the lying any more. Aunt Castlereagh guessed something was amiss and brought me. I had to come clean." The Duke appeared at the top of the staircase, his face set in stone. He descended slowly, each step deliberate. "Mother, Miss Deverell, let us continue this discussion in my study, without an audience." The door had barely closed before the Dowager launched another volley. "This is monstrous. The contracts, the settlements, the bans, all made under false pretenses. The scandal will ruin us. Julian, you must repudiate them both at once." Margaret gave a small, choked sob. Catherine moved to her side and took her hand. "You will not speak of my sister as if she were damaged goods. She was frightened with reason. I chose to take her place. The blame is mine." The Duke, who had been standing at the window with his back to the room, spoke without turning. "There will be no repudiation. The engagement stands." The Dowager's mouth opened and closed. "With which one?" He turned then, and his gaze found Catherine with the force of a physical blow. "With Miss Catherine Deverell, the woman who had the courage to walk into a house she believed harbored a monster to protect someone she loved. That is the woman I intend to marry." Margaret gasped. Catherine felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "Julian, you cannot mean that. You wanted an heir, a dutiful wife. I am neither docile nor easy to manage." "I am aware," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, the closest thing to a smile she had ever seen on his face. "I find my tastes have altered." The Dowager erupted in protests, lineage, reputation, the ton's merciless judgment, but the Duke silenced her with a raised hand. "Mother, I have spent 6 years letting the world think the worst of me. I will not spend another day letting them dictate whom I can or cannot love. This is my decision." Love. The word landed in Catherine's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She stared at him, searching for the cold stranger who had greeted her in the library, and found instead a man stripped of armor, bruised but unbroken, looking at her as though she were the first good thing to happen to him in years. "I have not said yes," she managed. "Then say no," he replied quietly. "But know that I will wait. I am very patient when it comes to things that matter." The Dowager stormed out. Margaret, still clinging to Catherine's hand, whispered, "Do you love him, Kit, truly?" Catherine had no answer. Or rather, she had an answer she was not yet ready to speak aloud. Outside, a rival suitor, Lord Philip Ashby, who had danced with Catherine at the Fawcett dinner, was spreading whispers that the Duke had coerced an innocent into a fraudulent betrothal. The rumor reached Wycombe by luncheon, carried by a smirking footman. The Duke's reaction was immediate and cold. "I will call him out." "You will not," Catherine said, stepping into his path. "You will let me handle Lord Ashby." That evening, at a soirée hosted by Lady Fawcett, Catherine walked directly up to Lord Ashby in a room full of gossips and delivered a set-down so precise, so scalpel-sharp, that 3 matrons applauded before catching themselves. "My lord, you mistake silence for weakness. You will cease your slanders, or I will publish a full account of your dealings with a certain milliner in Bath. I am not the shy girl you assumed. I am a Deverell, and we protect our own." Ashby turned the color of sour milk and retreated. The Duke, watching from across the room, felt something crack open inside his chest, a lock he had not known existed. When Catherine returned to his side, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a velvet box. Inside lay a ring of sapphires and diamonds, the Wycombe betrothal ring worn by 3 generations of duchesses. "Catherine Deverell," he said, loud enough for the room to hear, "will you do me the honor of accepting this ring, my name, and everything I am, which is far less than you deserve, but all that I have?" The silence that followed was not awkward but electric, every guest holding their breath. Catherine looked at the ring, at the man, at the life unfolding before her like a map she had not known she was following. "Yes," she said, "I will." Word of the Duke's public proposal swept through the ton faster than a fever. By the following week, every drawing-room in London hummed with variations of the scandal. Some called it romantic, more called it madness. Lady Jersey, that formidable patroness of Almack, was heard to remark that the Duke of Wycombe had always been an odd fish, and this merely proved it. But Catherine noticed that the invitations did not stop arriving. A duke, even a controversial one, was still a duke. The real test came at the Countess of Halstead's ball, the first major society event where Catherine and the Duke would appear together as an acknowledged couple. Margaret, still pale but growing steadier, had elected to attend alongside Benedict, who had appointed himself her unofficial protector. "I feel like a specimen in a cabinet," Catherine murmured as they ascended the staircase, the stairs prickling her skin. Julian's hand rested at the small of her back, a proprietary gesture she had come to welcome. "Let them stare. By the end of tonight, they will have something substantive to discuss." She glanced at him sharply. "What have you done?" He only guided her into the ballroom, where the dancing had paused, and a cluster of dowagers had gathered near the orchestra like a flock of crows anticipating carrion. Lady Halstead, a nervous hostess with a powdered wig tilted slightly askew, approached with visible trepidation. "Your Grace, Miss Deverell, that is, the correct Miss Deverell, there has been a rather unpleasant development. Lord Ashby has circulated a letter claiming the betrothal was made under duress. He demands the engagement be investigated." Catherine's stomach clenched, but before she could speak, Julian mounted the small dais where the orchestra sat. He raised a hand, and the room quieted by degrees. "My lords, ladies, I'm informed that a letter is circulating which questions the integrity of my betrothal to Miss Catherine Deverell. I will not dignify the author by naming him. I will simply state, in front of every witness here, that I am marrying Miss Deverell of my own free will with my full heart. A heart I did not know I still possessed until she walked into my home and refused to be intimidated by a man the world had labeled cruel. She did not flinch. She did not simper. She told me the truth when it would have been easier to lie. If anyone here believes that constitutes duress, let them speak now." Silence, thick, profound, stretching. Then Margaret, standing near the back with Benedict, stepped forward. Her voice shook, but it carried. "I am Margaret Deverell. I was the one who was afraid. My sister took my place out of love. She is braver than I am. And the Duke is not the man the rumors painted. I would trust him with her life." A murmur rippled through the crowd, not hostile but shifting, reassessing. Lady Jersey, seated near the hearth, raised her lorgnette and studied Julian for a long moment. Then she nodded once. The tide had turned. Lord Ashby, standing near the card room, saw the expression on the faces around him and slipped out through a side door, his scandal extinguished. Julian stepped down from the dais and returned to Catherine's side. "I believe that concludes the public portion of our engagement," he said. "Low and Rye, are you terribly displeased with me?" She looked at him, this man who had been carved from isolation and tragedy, who had wielded his reputation as a shield, who had just laid himself bare before 300 people for her sake. "I am not displeased," she said. "I am astonished and grateful, and rather in danger of making a scene if you do not dance with me immediately." He laughed. The sound was rusty with disuse, but it was a true laugh, and several matrons nearby exchanged startled glances. He led her onto the floor for a waltz, and as they turned beneath the chandeliers, Catherine felt the last of her fear dissolve. This was not a marriage of convenience, not a transaction, not a sacrifice. This was something she had not dared to name. "I love you," she said, so quietly the music nearly swallowed it. His hand tightened on her waist. "I know," he replied. "I have known since the moment you defended me to my own mother. I loved you before I understood what the feeling was. I suspect I shall love you for the remainder of my days." They were married 3 weeks later in the village church at Wycombe, a stone building so old the walls seemed to breathe memory. Catherine had requested a small ceremony, no crowds, no trumpets. Julian had agreed, though the tenants had decorated the churchyard with boughs of hawthorn regardless, and every pew was filled with faces that mattered. Margaret stood as Catherine's attendant, her earlier pallor replaced by a quiet bloom. She had spent the weeks of the engagement talking with Benedict in the walled garden, and something tender was growing there, unhurried and shy. The dowager, stiff but resigned, sat in the front pew wearing the Wycombe emeralds and an expression of guarded approval. She had inspected Catherine's trousseau, pronounced it adequate, and had even offered a thin smile during the wedding breakfast planning, a concession that felt, in the Wycombe family lexicon, almost gushing. Catherine walked down the aisle on her father's arm. The elder Mr. Deverell had arrived looking sheepish and weather-beaten, full of apologies his daughters did not require. "You've done well, Kit," he whispered as they approached the altar. "Better than I ever did." Julian stood waiting, dressed in dark blue superfine, his jaw tight with an emotion he had not yet learned to express freely. When he took her hand, his fingers were cold, but his grip was steady. The rector spoke the words. Catherine heard them as if through water, vows, rings, the ancient promises that bound one life to another. She was aware of Margaret weeping softly, of Benedict's hand resting on her sister's shoulder, of the light falling through the stained glass in ribbons of color. And then Julian was lifting her veil, and his eyes, those gray eyes she had once found so forbidding, held nothing but wonder. "You may kiss the bride," the rector said. Julian kissed her as though she were made of something precious and breakable, a reverence that brought a lump to Catherine's throat. The congregation, forgetting decorum, applauded. The wedding breakfast was held on the south lawn beneath a marquee that had been erected in haste but decorated in love. Tenants mixed with gentry. The cook had outdone herself with a cake crowned in sugar roses. Benedict gave a speech that was half toast, half affectionate mockery of his brother's previous aptitude for solitude. Julian bore it with a pained smile, his hand never leaving Catherine. As the afternoon softened into evening, the ducal carriage was brought round, packed for the journey to the coast. Margaret embraced Catherine fiercely. "Write to me, every week. I shall be unbearable otherwise." "You will be busy," Catherine said, glancing meaningfully toward Benedict, who was lingering nearby with a hopeful expression. "I suspect I shall be writing to congratulate you before the year is out." Margaret blushed, and it was answer enough. The carriage rolled away as the sun dipped behind the oaks. Julian pulled the curtains shut and turned to his wife with an expression that made her pulse quicken. "You are the Duchess of Wycombe now," he said. "There is no escape." "I do not want escape." She leaned into him, and his arms came around her with a possessiveness that no longer felt like a cage but like shelter. "I want this. I want you. All of you, Julian, the parts you show the world and the parts you hide. I am not afraid of shadows anymore." He pressed his lips to her hair. "I was a man waiting to become a ghost. You made me solid again. I do not have the words for what that means." "Then show me," she whispered. And in the gentle rocking of the carriage, with the sea air beginning to thread through the windows, he did, 8 months later. Spring returned to Wycombe with a gentleness that seemed almost deliberate, as if the land itself had decided to reward the house for its newfound warmth. The black velvet had been removed from the portrait of Eleanor, the late Duchess, and it now hung in the morning room with a small vase of fresh flowers beneath it, Catherine's doing. "She deserves to be remembered with light, not shadow," she had said, and Julian had not argued. Catherine, now visibly expecting their first child, sat in the walled garden where she had once sketched stone urns under Benedict's curious gaze. Her sketchbook was open again, but she was not drawing. She was watching her husband walk toward her across the lawn, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, an informality the old Julian would never have permitted. He dropped onto the bench beside her and placed a hand on the curve of her belly. "He kicked again this morning. I felt it." Catherine corrected with a smile. "I am convinced it is a girl. She has your stubbornness already." "Then heaven help us both." But his eyes were soft, and the lines that had once been carved by grief now framed laughter. The tenants had remarked on the change. The steward had confided to the housekeeper that the master smiled at least twice a day now, a statistic that would have been unthinkable a year ago. Margaret and Benedict had announced their own engagement the previous month. The news had surprised no one who had watched them during the wedding, but it had brought the dowager to near tears, though she insisted it was hay fever. The four of them would be spending Christmas together at Wycombe, a prospect that filled the house with a hum of anticipation. "I have been thinking," Julian said, intertwining his fingers with hers, "about the day you arrived. I was standing in the library, working myself into a cold rage over a bride I did not want. And then you walked in, wearing Margaret's name and your own courage, and I knew within 5 minutes that something was terribly wrong and terribly right." Catherine leaned her head against his shoulder. "You accused me of cataloging your flaws." "You were." "I found it infuriating and irresistible in equal measure." He paused, and his voice dropped. "I thought I was a man incapable of being saved. I thought love was a currency I had spent and lost. You proved me wrong on both counts." "You saved yourself," she said. "I merely insisted on honesty." "You insisted on everything, my attention, my respect, my heart." He turned his head to kiss her temple. "You have them all, permanently." The child kicked again, a flutter of life. Catherine placed Julian's hand more firmly against the spot, and they sat in silence while the bees hummed in the lavender and the shadows lengthened across the garden. Later, walking back to the house arm in arm, Catherine paused at the entrance to the library, the room where their battle of wills had begun. She looked up at her husband, the cruel Duke who had never truly been cruel, the man carved from stone who had discovered he was merely waiting for the right sculptor. "I love you," she said, because she said it often now, and each time it felt new. Julian cupped her face in his hands. "And I love you, not because you saved me, but because you saw the man I could be and demanded I become him. There is no gift greater than that." They stepped into the house together, the door closing gently behind them, and the sound that followed was not silence but laughter, the laughter of a home that had learned, against all expectation, to be happy.